What gave rise to the ugly ideology of this individual? New Zealand's Prime Minister asking the question on the day of the first funerals from the Christchurch mosque attacks. Jacinda Ardern's call in the wake of her country's worst ever terror attacks throws down the gauntlet to the entire planet. We focused on radical Islam. Have we underestimated the threat from the far right? And are they two sides of the same coin? The U.S. president dismisses the threat of white supremacists. Donald Trump instead calls the Christchurch massacres, quote, a senseless act. Was it senseless or part of a carefully crafted ideology? How much of the radicalization is down to politicians preying on the sense of fear and disenfranchisement of citizens whose world is changing fast? That sense of being dispossessed of one's livelihood and prospects is real. How to address it so it doesn't wind up feeding, well, an echo chamber of violence and hate. Today in the France 24 debate, we're asking just how great a threat do white supremacists pose? Joining us, New Zealand journalist Ian Borthwick. Thank you for being with us. Civil liberties attorney Asif Arif, the author of Being a Muslim in France.
Yes.
Welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
From Tuscaloosa, Alabama, Esna Serestad, author of One of Us, the book about Norway's far-right shooter Anders Behring Breivik. Thank you for being with us. And from State College, Pennsylvania, Joshua Inwood, geography professor at Penn State University. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter. Hashtag F24debate. Let's begin with those tributes that we've been seeing ever since last Friday. Among them, the one in Christchurch on Monday, first day back to school, an impromptu haka by high school students outside as they gathered. We've seen many hakas this week, Ian Borthwick, but that one, well, it's very emotional because it's impromptu.
Well, I think we'll see many more as the days go by. It's a very New Zealand reaction, and I think it was wonderful from those school children to be doing it near the mosque in the centre of Christchurch. What I thought was brilliant was kids from all over the city. I could tell the uniforms from various schools all over the city. There was private schools, public schools, girls' schools, boys' schools. Everybody was there together, Māori, Pākehā. So the whole of the community coming together to give what is, in fact, a very, very deeply New Zealand reaction to something like this.
Christchurch, we here in France, we associated with its rugby team, the Crusaders.
Yes.
We don't think of it suddenly seeing Christchurch in the news like this.
It's part of the shock, part of the reason that New Zealanders and even people outside New Zealand, I think, are so shocked because the country had never had any terrorism attack ever, apart from the Rainbow Warrior in 1985, where one person died. And I think the country as a whole still regarded itself as a privileged little corner of the Pacific which was cut off and protected from the violence and terrorism that's going on in the world. And I think that's one of the things that the people are having to come to terms with in Christchurch at the moment. And you mentioned the rugby team, and you may also know that the rugby team from Canterbury, or the province of Canterbury in the town of Christchurch, is called the Crusaders. And following the events, there's a very real move to possibly change the name of that team, feeling that it is no longer appropriate in today's world. Crusaders, given the actions of the deranged Australian who killed so many people.
Yeah, and deranged is the word. Asif Arif, before we talk about him, let me ask you, there's this hashtag that's gone viral in New Zealand, They Are Us. Your thoughts on that?
I mean, they definitely they are us. I mean, in Europe, all the terrorist attack that happened in America, all these terrorist attack in Africa. Actually, we forget sometime about Burkina Faso, Mali, all these terrorist attack that happened. They united in some way. They united in the grievance, in the same sharing, the fact that we are sharing the same emotion when we're facing this. It could be the Bataclan, it could be the mosque. The horrific the sentiment is the same actually. So definitely they are us.
Is Nasirstad the attacker? The prime minister has made a point of not saying his name. His idea was to get attention, and thus that she says that's why she won't give his name. Your thoughts on how authorities have handled really this news?
You mean, I'm sorry, I came late into the debate here. You mean the authorities in New Zealand?
In New Zealand, yes.
Yes, well, that seems to be wonderfully handled up to now. The Prime Minister has definitely taken on the role of a very, morally strong, very decent and emotional and very dealing with the victims, but also taking political acts when it comes to, gun control and also the methods of far-right extremism and white supremacy. So I'm very impressed by the New Zealand Prime Minister.
Jacinda Ardern, who's captured her nation's mood, the New Zealand Prime Minister donning the Muslim veil to comfort families of the victims, opening a session of Parliament with Salam Alaikum, may peace be with you in Arabic, announcing a tightening of her country's liberal gun control laws, and calling to task social media giants and the rest of the planet, like in this interview with the BBC.
I would make that a global call. What New Zealand experienced here was violence brought against us by someone who grew up and learnt their ideology somewhere else. So actually, if we want to make sure that globally we are a safe and tolerant and inclusive world, we cannot think about this in terms of boundaries.
Joshua Inwood, you heard at the outset Ian Borthwick describe his native Christchurch as a place that, seemed immune to some of the rest of the world's problems. What do you think of what the New Zealand's Prime Minister's, quote, global call?
Well, I mean, I think she's hit a really important point. I think what we've seen in particular over the last 15 years or so is a global upsurge in white nationalism and white supremacy. You see it in Europe, you see it in Australia. Unfortunately, this week we saw it in New Zealand. And I think, particularly in the United States, we bear a special responsibility over the last several years, particularly with President Donald Trump. There's kind of been a normalization of hate rhetoric and hate speech in our political discourse. I think it's important to point out that discourse has always been part and parcel of American politics, but it's really come to the forefront. And with social media, the ability to spread those messages and to radicalize or connect radicalized white men and the advent and the access of guns, it's really a dangerous mix, and it is a pressing global problem.
A pressing global problem. It's been, nearly 8 years since the shooting in Oslo, near Oslo, by Anders Behring Breivik. Let me ask you. You devoted a book to this, Anna Seierstad. Is there a failure on the part of the planet? Have we not flagged enough the threat of white supremacists?
It's definitely a growing threat, and obviously we have not flagged it enough. We have failed to monitor it, and it's quite amazing that he was able to write online on his Facebook account what his plans were. I'm not sure how long before he was able to do that, and he was filming it online. And definitely these groups, just as should be monitored, just as the authorities have been able to crush ISIS presence online to 90% by, making Twitter suppressor accounts, using algorithms in order to find out who are their followers and so on. So it's not impossible to crush those networks. I mean, not totally, and they are not as, they're more dispersed, they're more decentralized than the ISIS network was online. But I think that the radicalization today is among the white supremacists on the far right is going on first and foremost on the internet. So that's important to monitor. And of course, as the former speaker talked about, the debate climate, the words that Breivik used in his manifesto, they are getting into or streaming into more or less into the mainstream among mainstream right-wing politicians. And that's very scary.
That's very scary. Let me turn to the civil liberties attorney in the House here. Asif Arif, the 17 minutes of Facebook Live during the shooting. When I put it to fellow journalists last Friday saying, well, maybe we're not grown up enough yet to have Facebook Live. They said, oh, no, there's freedom of speech, and well, you shouldn't curtail it. What do you do when in that balance between safety and freedom of speech when it comes to
Definitely, there is freedom of speech. The problem is not the freedom of speech. The problem is the boundaries and the limit of the freedom of speech here. And the problem is our democracy don't want to limit the free speech, because they feel like if we limit the free speech, then we go towards the fact that nobody can express itself or nobody can express its view. But in expressing view and expressing hatred content, there is a huge gap. And this is what we cannot understand here.
But then whose job is it to decide what is just a view and what is hate speech?
Definitely, there is a lot of body. For example, in France, the judge is responsible, the judicial is responsible. If you need a quick action, of course, normally Facebook and Twitter should have this inside process in order to focus on those who are sharing hate content and localize them and stop them. And then after, you have different governmental bodies who can stop these sharing content. For example, this video that he actually made was not widely shared because the Prime Minister has said, don't share it, because Facebook has taken the proper action to stop it. But why this guy could go to this far, I think there is a problem of maybe anticipation, going further away, going faster, and this is the algorithm issues.
Yeah, well,
there's clearly also a problem of reaction, because 17 minutes is a very long time for something like that to be able to be streamed. I mean, if a photographer puts on a photograph on Facebook showing breasts, for instance, it's immediately blocked and an account gets blocked. How is it possible that someone can stream something so disgusting and unconscionable for 17 minutes before something's done about it?
And there is also the issue of those who were watching this before. Because the thing is, with this content of the photograph that you mentioned, is the fact that other people can declare to Facebook that this content is violating some of Facebook rules. But why nobody, during this 17-minute sequence, has declared that to Facebook that is violating Facebook rules?
Is there too much self-regulation, Joshua Inwood?
No, I think the thing that we have to think about, and the thing that I would kind of urge viewers to think about, is this notion of the difference between freedom of speech is not the same thing as freedom of responsibility. And the Prime Minister of New Zealand was correct to say that corporations in particular, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, they have a responsibility to think about the images and the content that is being streamed on their services, on their platforms, and the way that those allow radicalized people to connect or people to become radicalized. Like what happened in the United States with Dylan Roof and the Charleston 9 shooting. There was a kid who or a young man who connected to a whole host of radical groups and radical literature online, and he went and he killed 9 people. If that had happened and the race had been different or the religion had been different, there would have been a much different discussion, I would argue, in this country and probably internationally about what we should do about this content. And so I would like to see us think about what responsibilities do corporations have and do we as individuals have in terms of engaging with this kind of hate speech and calling it out where it exists and holding corporations responsible for the content on their platforms.
The light touch regulation, though, when it comes to these issues in the United States, started long before Donald Trump was elected. We see that to the United States, I get the impression, Joshua, that there's always this argument that you have this sacrosanct First Amendment, the right to free speech, and the whole rest of the world, because these are U.S. tech giants, has to play by it.
Well, I think you've actually hit on a really, really important point. And that is that the United States is an exporter of content, both in terms of online platforms, in terms of movies, in terms of music, in terms of a whole host of other things. And we in this country arguably have a special responsibility. And again, we are living in a political context in which a president who connects to and connects with white supremacist ideology is in the White House, and that has changed the discussion in this country, but it's also changed the stakes both here domestically and also internationally. There was a recent study that talked about in the last 3 years, hate crimes in this country are up 30%, really with the election of Donald Trump. Hate groups are at an all-time high in this country. And so we are living in a particular political moment where white nationalism and white supremacy is on the upsurge. And we in this country, and I would argue globally, need to engage in a broader discussion about this reality and about how we are going to politically engage with this moment. And it's tied to a whole host of other global questions as well.
Ian Borthwick, Christchurch is a long way from Washington, D.C. Did you think about those things last Friday when you first heard the news? Were you thinking that maybe somehow the U.S. president was an enabler of all this?
I think maybe he's enabled a certain climate around the world, and he's given free rein to that sort of mentality, which has grown and which has come in and planted itself in New Zealand. But I think for the time being, it's a problem which New Zealand has to confront. I agree with the New Zealand Prime Minister. There has to be a global response. It's like, and I think this could be a real catalyst for putting to death this sort of white nationalism and white supremacy, these ideas that have become so current. And I think it'll have to start in New Zealand. And I have a feeling that that's already starting, that the country itself may be able to use this as a catalyst for even further change. I think New Zealand as a whole historically has had a very, I would say, has been very proud of its race relations record and what it's been able to do over the years since colonisation. But it's certainly not perfect. And I know from a lot of Maori friends in New Zealand that there is still today, and Polynesian friends in New Zealand, there is still low-level white supremacy, racism that they live with every day. And this can be a real catalyst for change in the country.
All right, we're going to pick up on this point when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're rebounding off that global call by New Zealand's Prime Minister to tackle the issue of white supremacist ideology. With us to talk about it, New Zealand journalist and Christchurch native Ian Borthwick. Also with us, civil liberties attorney Asif Arif, the author of Being Muslim in France. From Tuscaloosa in Alabama, Esna Seierstad, the author of One of Us, about Anders Breivik, the Norwegian shooter of 2011. And Joshua Inwood, who teaches geography at Penn State College in Pennsylvania. Immediately after the attack, Donald Trump was asked about his response. Here's what he had to say in the Oval Office.
Our hearts are with them and whatever we can do. You see today white nationalism as a rising threat around the world. I don't really. I think it's a small group of people that have very, very serious problems. I guess if you look at what happened in New Zealand, perhaps that's a case. I don't know enough about it yet. They're just learning about the person and the people involved. But it's certainly a terrible thing, terrible thing.
What do you make of that, Esna Seierstad?
Well, it's like it's not right, because this is the year that you've had more violent attacks in the U.S. from the far right than ever since 1995 and the Tim McVeigh attack. So it is on the rise, and also the debate. It's a very polarized debate here in the US, and it's a debate also based on fear, and it's about inciting fear in people, and the fear is coming from outside. I mean, the enemy, I have to say, the threat is coming from outside, from mass immigration or from Islam, which is threatening the US way of life. So it's, I mean, the debate here in the US, I find very scary.
Is it down to Donald Trump? Can you blame the US president?
No, of course not. We can't. I mean, you mean the debate or the attack?
The rise in the number of attacks that you mentioned.
The debate climate. Well, I think it wouldn't be right of me to link that directly to the president here. So I mean, we have to think in longer lines, and I believe that. I mean, he's not helping on the debate, because this is also about, talking to each other. Like both extremist groups of the far right and the radicalized Islamists, they feed on each other. They need each other as enemies. And when into the mainstream, the same kind of words, the same kind of rhetoric is being used. If not, they of course they don't support attacks on either side, but it's becoming a rhetoric of almost going to war kind of rhetorics, and people are talking about here not a civil war but a cultural civil war, and I think that is definitely something that goes all the way to the top, and it's also now that the U.S. government has started to defund organizations that are fighting against far right. So it's going in the wrong direction.
How did we get to this point, as if we had this wave of terror attacks perpetrated by radical Islamists? We have the kind of attack we saw in Christchurch, which some say it was a long time coming. The fact that, as you heard Esna describe, they feed off of one another. Why do we have this current mood?
Definitely. The first thing is there is a rise of far-right extreme policy as well in Europe. You can see it in Holland. You can see it even in Paris when Marine Le Pen comes to the second tour of the presidential election. So this is very important. And actually, Marine Le Pen did the pretty much same exploit than Donald Trump. She condemned the attack without mentioning the word mosques, Muslim or Islam, which is very interesting, right? So the first thing is we should stop these discrimination against those who are affected by these attacks. Name the enemy, of course, name the radical people who are Islamists, who are attacking Christian in the Middle East, who are attacking here in Paris and in different places of the world. But also to name the enemy, which is the far right-wing enemy, and the fact that they are not naming it, they are saying, yes, we are with them. Listen what Donald Trump has said. No, we are with the Muslim who were praying in this place of worship.
Well, let's listen to the New Zealand Prime Minister, Donald Trump, who offered his help. Here's what, on the heels of that clip you just heard, what Jacinda Ardern had to say.
I spoke with Donald Trump this morning. He sought to call us directly. He very much wished for his condolences to be passed on to New Zealand. He asked what offer of support the United States could provide. My message was sympathy and love for all Muslim communities.
Ian Borthwick.
Wow, I hadn't seen that. Yeah.
She's since toned down, saying, "Look, I don't want to get too much involved." But this was this.
I think it was a very clear message to Donald Trump and to the United States. And I think that she's been exemplary in the way she's shown compassion.
Has she surprised you?
No, not really. I knew that she was capable of that, but I think she's even been better than I thought she was able of doing. And I think she's shown such great compassion and such charisma at a time which is, which she said herself, the darkest day in New Zealand, one of the darkest days in New Zealand's history. And she really shone out, and I think she can shine out as a leader for the rest of the world.
So she's center left. She's in a coalition, though.
She's in a coalition, yes.
With right wing party.
Yeah.
the right-wing party hasn't said word once when she the other day said we're going to have tougher gun control.
No, I don't think they. I think the feeling in New Zealand has been completely behind her, and I think most people were completely unaware and shocked to learn that you could have such guns in New Zealand. You said before that they were liberal gun laws. I didn't think they were liberal myself. Apparently, they are slightly more liberal than Australia, but they're nothing like the gun laws in the United States. But she certainly came out and said they will change. And as you know, on Monday morning when Parliament gathered, that was what the first thing they did was to decide to change the gun laws. And a lot of people are, in fact, are voluntarily bringing in. A lot of farmers have had semi-automatic weapons for getting rid of pests, for hunting deer, actually, because they're a threat to the ecology of New Zealand. And that's the only reason that semi-automatic weapons have ever been in New Zealand. But they now realise that their hobby, or the necessity for the farming community to have these weapons, is nothing compared to what has happened in New Zealand, and a lot of people are handing them in and relinquishing them voluntarily.
Joshua Inwood, of course, that didn't happen in the United States when, in the past. I don't want to have the whole gun control debate because it's one that we've had before, but the idea of these concrete steps that you've seen from New Zealand, the pressure put on social media, the fact that you have this global call to tackle white supremacists. How much mileage will Jacinda Ardern get?
Well, I mean, in the U.S. context, at least, I think there's been a great outpouring of sympathy, obviously, for New Zealand and the people. But the reality is we're living in a polarized society and a polarized politics, which makes some of the things that she did in New Zealand just simply not politically possible in this kind of moment. We're kind of already gearing up towards a presidential election, a year and a half out from that. And, the politics in this country are going to be pretty intense for the next 18 months around a lot of these kinds of questions. And so, I just don't really see us being able to engage in any kind of the critical debate that she called for, both globally, but also in some respects, we have some of our own house here in the United States to kind of put into order and to kind of work out, which we frankly just have not done in a really meaningful way or had a really long conversation around civil rights, gun control, a whole host of other things, really since the 1960s. And so, there's a political moment here in this country, and there's going to be a kind of reckoning, I think, with what has been going on both domestically and internationally. And that's going to be part and parcel of what this political election is going to be about for the president.
All right. It sounds polarized. A lot of fans of New Zealand's Prime Minister on the hashtag F24 debate. This one saying, every leader who represents their country and the world needs to learn a lesson from Jacinda Ardern on how to deny terrorists fame. Now, there's what she said to Donald Trump, and then there's Recep Tayyip Erdogan, Turkey's president, lashing out at both Australia, where the shooter is from, and New Zealand. Charlie James explains.
Evoking a historic battle, Turkey's president starts a war of words. At a political rally, Recep Tayyip Erdogan linked the gunmen in the Christchurch massacres to the bloody battle at Gallipoli. In that World War I battle, Australian and New Zealand troops fought Turkish forces. Erdogan presented the mosque attacks that killed 50 people as part of an assault on Turkey and Islam, and he issued a warning to anti-Muslim Australians.
We've been here for 1,000 years, and God willing, we'll be here until doomsday too. You will not be able to turn Istanbul into Constantinople. Your grandfathers came and saw that we were here. Then some returned by foot, and some returned in coffins. In the event you come with the same intentions, we're waiting for you. Have no doubt that we'll send you off just like your grandfathers.
Erdogan appeared to be responding to references about Turkey in the so-called manifesto of the Australian suspected attacker. The president promised his country will make the suspect pay if New Zealand does not. Turkey is holding local elections on March 31st, and Erdogan has been accused of using the attack to stoke anti-Western sentiment and motivate his voters. The president's comments have prompted shock in New Zealand and Australia, as well as a tough response.
It is truly upsetting I have conveyed that in the strongest of possible terms to the Turkish ambassador today, and I do not accept the excuses that have been offered for those comments.
New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern says her nation's foreign minister will set the record straight during his visit to Istanbul this week. And Scott Morrison announced his government is reviewing Australia's official travel advice to Turkey.
As if we talked about Donald Trump's reaction, what do you think of Recep Tayyip Erdogan?
Well, I think he's responding to polarization by another polarization. So that will not help the debate. We're talking here that we need moderate leader in order to come to the same platform and to respond to these global problem. And by isolating himself and saying that we're going to give lesson to this guy if New Zealand does not. It's not a good message, but apparently there is some political agenda as well at the same time in this country.
Yes,
so that might
coming up to those local elections.
That might definitely play a game here. But I think they should join themselves with the global war against these kind of person rather than doing their own statement, which is not really into the good way.
I mean, he's trying to get some political mileage out of it, but I have to say, for any Australian in New Zealand, it's deeply shocking because this battle in Gallipoli was not just any battle. The Battle of Gallipoli was actually a seminal moment, I would think, in the birth of these two nations, Australia and New Zealand. And every year on 25th of April, thousands, hundreds of thousands, or tens of thousands of young Kiwis and young Australians go to Gallipoli to sleep on the beach and to see the sun come up and celebrate the deaths, both of Turkey and of New Zealand and Australia. And so this is deeply, deeply hurtful for all Australians and New Zealanders. And I'm sure the Deputy Prime Minister of New Zealand will try and get some sort of apology from Turkey.
Isna Sairstad, it brings us back to the question we asked earlier, which is why are we in this this world now where everybody seems to be stirring up polarization?
Why are we in this? It's a difficult question, but I think it's been happening over the last decade. And when Anders Breivik, who is an inspiration for many of these far-right figures, there was just last month the Coast Guard, the U.S. Coast Guard, who was apprehended with a plot, with plans targeting major Democratic politicians here in the U.S. So that guy who wrote his manifesto in 2010, 2011, what he wrote then, when I read it back then 8 years ago, it felt like, new, or what was this? And he was talking about, the cultural Marxists, the traitors in the elite, how, the liberal elites had left the whiteness of Europe behind. And what's interesting is that kind of rhetoric, if not his method, but the rhetoric is going into the mainstream. So I think that's just very irresponsible. I think that, I've written a book about Anders Breivik, and I've been criticized and asked, aren't you making him into a hero? Aren't you then, making propaganda out of, his words? But the thing is, we have to confront these people, and, we have to put fire under their feet, and just otherwise we have to expose their ideas in order to, look at them and dissect them. But it's very important that we just don't, put their words just out there, spew them out. So I think that there should be a responsible confrontation, and that must start, from the top. It must be progress in the school. And I think every single one of us are responsible. We are responsible to realize, we are in this society together. We're in this world together. There are not two worlds or several worlds that have more rights than others to be in, that or other territories. So I think that, this is something we all have to work with.
So you bring up a crucial point here, which is how you tackle the issue, how you deal with it. Joshua Inwood, the Washington Post this Wednesday published a story about a report that was put out on how to tackle hate speech when it comes up at the middle school level, at the high school level. One of the recommendations of the report was to get the students to talk about it rather than just punish the perpetrators of the hate speech. When you look at the mood on college campuses, how is that changing?
Well, like everything in every institution in American society, there's no question that universities have become a political battleground. I think we've seen that with some free speech debates in Berkeley. We've certainly seen that when some of the radical right has shown up on campus, and there's been protests around that. In terms of at least the Penn State University, I mean, there's a core group of students who really want to tackle these issues, and in particular, issues of white supremacy and white nationalism and white violence.
And is it an echo chamber where those who all think one way get together and those who all think the other get together, or is there dialogue between various communities on campus?
I think, at least, speaking at Penn State, there's been some real efforts to create some dialogue. There's been some groups that have brought together people from different political ideologies to talk around issues. And I was just talking to a student this morning who is really interested in engaging around a kind of broader truth and reconciliation process, at least here at Penn State, around some longstanding issues of race and racial division that have existed both in the community and in the university itself. And I'll say this, one of the things that about this moment that potentially is a small silver lining, though it's tough to think about that in the context of the loss of life, is if you think about, at least in the United States context, the civil rights movement was really, we think of Martin Luther King, we think of Rosa Parks, but it was really college age and younger students who led that movement. And there has been a real awakening at least in this campus, and I think in a lot of other campuses, of college age students and younger students about the need to engage in this struggle and to think about all different kinds of political strategies. Many of them, and most of them, are actually rooted in kind of notions of King and nonviolence. And so there's a moment here of sadness and grief, and we need to certainly hold the victims of the shooting in New Zealand in our hearts and hold close to them, just like we would lots of other people who have suffered extreme violence in the last week and month and year. But we also have a political moment to think about let's engage with one another and let's push some of these debates forward, and let's start having some real conversations about how do you root out radical white nationalism? How do you root it out of the political discourse? How do you root it out in our communities? And how do you confront it? And what does that confrontation look like?
Azif Arif, let's talk about France a second here. Yes. Since the attacks of 2015, this was the first thing that people said. We need to that there needs to be debate in schools. There was even talk in schools after the Charlie Hebdo attacks. When you look, it's been 4 years on. How's that going? I mean,
I think France is pretty repressive in his way of seeing things, because rather than promoting education around what was going on, what is the true purpose of Islam, for example, what is the religion, what is the Quran saying, what is the jihad, to try to really explain what are the true concept of Islam, we start doing legislation about state of emergency, for example, how to house arrest some people who are a threat. But the threatening part was like, if you just friend with someone who is threatening, you're going to get house arrest.
So there hasn't been more dialogue?
No, there hasn't been that much dialogue. And you mentioned the fact that right after the 2015 attack, they started saying we need to address it in schools. But you should remember as well that an 8-year-old kid got into custody because he talked about it, and we said he's doing a terrorism apology. So I think we should be... the
French have a repressive tendency.
Yeah, the French have
another point on this. It was this long rambling that Esna talked about it. This long rambling manifesto that was written by the shooter in New Zealand. He mentioned a trip to France. He mentioned a thing. One of the there's been talk ever since about the quote French inspiration for him. In particular, there's this right-wing intellectual who peddled this conspiracy theory about the grand replacements that foreigners, be they from other cultures, were coming to replace white Christians. Is that just fringe talk, or is that something that's seeped into the mainstream?
No, I think this is really important. And I think it joined everybody's position here in this show, because the problem of the great replacement of Camus theory is the fact that we're going to be replaced by the immigration, by the fact that someone else would impose their religion on us. So the problem is, for example, different body in our country, including media, we were giving promotion to these ideas. We were giving promotion to different images, the fact that Aquarius, there is just 140 people coming into our country. And it was a manner to say, oh, this is a huge immigration process. Everybody
All
will
right,
be...
give me, in that case, give me tips here as a journalist, because when you have, for instance, a small town in France, people live an isolated life, and the local cafe closes and it's replaced by a kebab shop. Some locals might complain, saying, "What's this? This isn't French." And what do you do in that case? How do you address the fears of the citizens?
I think you can address it in a very lovely manner. You could say the fact that coffee is closing, you're losing jobs, but the fact that kebab is opening, you're creating jobs. So I think there is always a good response to it, but it's the way we're choosing to put the information forward. If we put the information forward that the other person is the problem, is our enemy, and he's coming to take our employment, to take our place, and to take our businesses, this is not the way to do fraternité in French. Right. So the way is the way to put information forward.
Ian Borthwick, do you feel as though there's more dialogue on these issues in France the last couple of years, or not?
I don't think there's been more dialogue in France. No, I think there's been less, if any. I think that there's still there's a confusion between Islam and Islamic terrorism or extremism.
Yeah, definitely.
And I think that's part of the problem of Islam across the world. Yeah. And I think what's happened in New Zealand, I think that the deranged murderer has his aim. He's missed his aim, basically, because certainly there are a lot of dead people, but the reaction across the country has been one of great compassion and of inclusiveness. And when you see Catholic boys going to the local mosque in Auckland and singing there, when you see violent, what's known as violent motorcycle gangs offering to protect the mosque in a town in Hamilton and the Waikato, then you see that I think that the exact opposite of what he was trying to achieve has happened in New Zealand, and this can be an example for the rest of the world.
All right, Ian Borthwick, I want to thank you so much. I want to thank as well Azif Arif, Joshua Inwood for joining us from State College, Pennsylvania, and Isna Sarastad from Tuscaloosa, Alabama. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.